You wake to the sound of footsteps echoing through stone corridors measured, impersonal, the rhythm of a palace that has learned to move without looking down. They grow louder, more urgent, as if hurrying away from you rather than toward you. Your small hands clutch a rough wool blanket that smells of damp limestone and something older, a sediment of neglect that clings to fabric the way lichen clings to walls. Through a narrow slit of a window, dawn breaks over Vienna in 1793, but no light reaches this forgotten tower room of the Habsburg palace. The day is out there, gilding domes and waking courtiers. Here, morning merely changes the shade of darkness. They tell you nothing, no birthdays, no catechism, no counting to 10. You are 7, so the midwives said once, in a voice that slipped and vanished like steam, but numbers do not live in this room. A name was given at your baptism, the kind that carries centuries. Ferdinand perhaps, or Franz. It belongs to the ledger, not to your mouth. No one uses it here. Names, like mirrors, have been removed. Your attendant enters, not a nurse, not a governess, just a woman paid to ensure that feeding and forgetting occur on schedule. Her shoes make no sound on the rushes. She keeps her eyes above your head, as though the mortar between the stones requires study. She sets down a bowl of porridge, already cooling to the room's temperature, and retreats with the caution of someone keeping faith with both coin and conscience. Words would be too heavy, she has learned. They might settle into the cracks and grow. Outside, other children wake to tutors and violins. They will learn Latin aphorisms and the geometry of etiquette, how to glide into a room as if the air itself were holding open the doors. They will learn the delicate arithmetic of marriages that end wars. Inside your room, dust motes drift in the single thread of light that makes it across the floor before the sun climbs beyond your window's angle. You watch the dust as if it were a language, and perhaps it is. You track how they rise, scatter, return rearrangements that translate into calm, a pattern you can hold. This is not a tomb, the attendants would insist if asked. The child is fed, clothed, housed in the emperor's own walls. And yet it is a tomb of a particular kind, the kind the living build for the living when the shape of a mind does not fit the mold pressed by power. Here, aristocratic blood means nothing if the face is red as a sign and the eyes carry a shape the era has taught itself to fear. Your features, soft, unmistakably marked, are treated not as a possibility but as a verdict. What we now understand as Down syndrome has no such name in this year. The map of the body's smallest instructions has not been drawn. Chromosomes are an undiscovered country, and the extra copy of the 21st, so ordinary and so transformative, has yet to be seen beneath a lens that will not exist for generations. In this age, the explanation is simpler and more terrible. God's displeasure, a mother's sin, a bloodline taxed by its own pride, a moon too full on the wrong night. Physicians keep notebooks that say weakness and imbecility in a hand trained to avoid the eyes of queens. Priests know Latin for mercy and Latin for shame and administer both as needed. Blame becomes a sacrament, secrecy a rite. The palace, which can catalogue every button on a uniform, has no system for you. The dynasty measures its future in contracts and christenings, and a child who cannot be trained to smile on cue threatens arithmetic more than affection. The arithmetic is merciless. Every prince and princess is a coin struck with the mint mark of God's favor. A coin that bears an unexpected image is removed from circulation, not melted down too cruel, even here, but stored away, where it cannot confuse the market. But cruelty can be very quiet. It can be the absence of a voice in a room, the turning of a latch, the habit of avoiding a face. It can be the way the woman never uses your name, because to call something by its name is to owe it an answer. It can be the way the porridge is placed where you must cross the stone to reach it, as if to prove some lesson about the virtue of effort. It can be the way no one notices that you have made a game of the dust motes, or that your humming falls into a rhythm that matches the clock 3 rooms away. It can be the conviction that erasing an audience is the same as erasing a life. If you were born to a peasant house beyond the ring of city walls, the story might unspool differently. There, a mind that moves at another pace can be fitted to the day's tasks. Chickens need feeding, kindling needs sorting. A hearth is an abacus of moments learned by repetition. There are words for difference in those houses, and many of them are not unkind. But in palaces, difference is political. A wobble at a dinner table becomes a rumor across borders. A misunderstood word becomes a prophecy in the hands of enemies. The same variation that a field would absorb like rain becomes a flood in a throne room. The woman leaves. The footsteps retreat, softened by distance into the pulse of a building that has known how to swallow sound for centuries. You lift the spoon, clumsy in a way that makes sense to you, and eat while the light moves. If you had a story, this would be its first line. A child sits in an imperial tower, and the empire arranges itself so he will never be seen. We will call this a beginning, though it is already the middle of a custom older than anyone here. This is not a single Habsburg sin, or a single year's habit, but a pattern stitched across courts and languages. Behind gilt doors and ceiling frescoes where angels tumble in permanent sunshine, there are rooms like this. In them, children like you grow to the age their hearts will allow, puzzling out their world from the few textures it offers. Stone, wool, a bowl, the line of light that shifts with the sun. They are not curses, they are not omens. They are not the proof of a god's displeasure with a queen's private grief. They are simply and entirely children. That is what history will have to learn to say. But history is late to most lessons, and in the meantime, courtiers write careful letters, and ledgers omit names, and window slits measure time in narrow increments. If we step back only a little into the broader corridor of years, we can say this much without anachronism. The condition that marks your face also marks the world that confines you. The extra thread in your code reveals the missing thread in theirs. A court that prides itself on mastery cannot bear an unmastered life, and so it chooses a manageable absence over a complicated presence. It is easier to build a silence than a bridge. Even within that silence, currents of tenderness persist like groundwater beneath stone. A nurse saves a drawing and presses it between pages. A kitchen boy lingers at the door to hear your humming rhyme with the clock. A priest, thinking himself unwatched, traces a cross not of pity but of recognition. These are not yet a language the palace can hear. They are footnotes in margins the archivists will later scrape clean. For now, the room holds. The porridge cools again, in the bowl you have emptied. The dust resettles. Outside, the city lifts its shutters. Someone is practicing scales. Someone else is signing a treaty that will ripple across maps on tables where candles burn long after midnight. In the tower, a child arranges 3 stones into a triangle because the shape pleases them, and hums a tune that pleases them, and waits for the next footstep, the next bowl, the next inch of light. The arithmetic of the palace has judged this arrangement unsightly, but arithmetic and beauty are not always friends, and the difference between them will be the story we follow into other rooms, other palaces, other centuries that will insist they could not have known better. This is where we begin, with a small life in a large building, a name unspoken, a dynasty that believes perfection is proof. In the quiet, we will listen for what the records could not bear to write. In the dark, we will try to see what the frescoes never showed. And in the dust that lifts and settles, we will learn how much can be said by things that were never meant to speak. The Habsburg child's tower is only one room in a sprawling pattern, a single tile in a mosaic that repeats across centuries of palaces. To understand why those chambers of silence existed, why bowls of cold porridge replaced tutors and celebrations, we must step into the logic of royal bloodlines. Monarchies thrived on the idea of divine right. Kings and queens were not merely rulers, but chosen instruments, their families stitched into a cosmic order that justified power. Blood was more than liquid. It was covenant, proof that heaven itself had stamped approval on a dynasty. Every royal birth was a ceremony of politics as much as of family, a public declaration that the line was strong, pure, and blessed. In such a world, children were not simply beloved sons and daughters. They were living treaties, promises of alliances, yet to be formed, collateral in the endless chess game of Europe. A princess might seal peace between empires by marrying into another royal house. A prince could embody future armies or inherit disputed lands. Each child was currency valuable only if unblemished. This is why the birth of a child who could not fulfill these duties was treated not as a private sorrow but as a political catastrophe. A prince who could not master languages or perform the intricate bows of court protocol threatened to destabilize alliances. A princess, unable to present herself with grace at diplomatic gatherings, imperiled the notion of her family's perfection. These were not abstractions, they were survival. For monarchies, image was as vital as armies. Among peasants, the calculus was different. A child born with what we now call Down syndrome might be regarded as a burden, yes, but often also as a blessing, God's will, as grandmothers in villages whispered. Such a child could carry water, tend goats, sweep floors, or sit by the hearth shaping straw into small patterns. The rhythm of agrarian life had space for tasks that did not require letters or diplomacy. Family ties were bonds of survival, not of treaties. The measure was not perfection but contribution, however small. And love, though often expressed in silence, needed no justification. But in palaces, even love was rationed. Imagine a queen, exhausted from childbirth, presented with an infant whose features were slightly unfamiliar, the almond-shaped eyes, the softer bridge of the nose, the small tongue slipping out as though words would struggle to form. Physicians looked grave. Priests muttered prayers. A husband might turn away, calculating what whispers might spread through the corridors. In that moment, the mother was not only a parent, but also a custodian of the dynasty's image. What she felt, love, grief, or fear, was irrelevant compared to what the court would decide. Royal bloodlines were already fragile, often maintained through marriages so close they would scandalize us now. Cousins wed cousins, uncles wed nieces. The Habsburg jaw became a grotesque family signature, a bone-deep reminder of generations folding in upon themselves. When a child emerged who did not fit the portrait of strength, suspicion instantly turned to inbreeding, to divine disfavor, to cosmic punishment. Every such birth was a threat not only to the present but to the very mythology of superiority that sustained royal rule. And so the decision was made, again and again, in gilded chambers across Europe. These children would be hidden. Not killed outright. Royal blood was too sacred, even in deviation, but erased. A record of stillbirth here, an illness there, a quiet retreat to a convent or a secluded wing of the palace. Attendants were paid, priests sworn to silence, portraits abandoned. These were disappearances carried out with velvet gloves, but disappearances nonetheless. What we must understand is that the cruelty was systemic, not only personal. A king or queen might have wept in private, might have felt the urge to cradle their child and whisper lullabies, but the weight of the crown pressed those instincts flat. Royalty demanded masks. To show tenderness toward a child deemed unfit for rule was to risk whispers that one valued sentiment over duty. And duty, in courts built on centuries of bloodshed and intrigue, was never optional. Even language revealed the hierarchy. In records, disabled royal children were described in euphemisms: weak, delicate, frail, words that erased without quite lying. In letters, phrases such as "the poor little soul" or "mercifully released" gave the impression of inevitability. To name the condition would have been to admit imperfection into bloodlines that claimed divine perfection. Silence was safer. Silence was armor, and yet, within that silence, contradictions festered. Monarchs proclaimed themselves God's chosen while trembling at the evidence that their children were as vulnerable to nature's variations as any farmer's brood. Dynasties that claimed to rise above the common herd were revealed, in these moments, to be bound by the same randomness that shaped every human birth. The fear was not simply of gossip, it was of exposure. Exposure that royal blood was not proof of anything beyond biology. The hidden children, then, are not only stories of cruelty, they are mirrors. They reflect the fragility of a system that could not admit imperfection without collapsing its own mythology. They reveal how deeply the architecture of monarchy was built not on love or family but on performance. To parade a child in public was to declare stability. To hide a child in silence was to protect the illusion. Thus, the tower rooms, the convent chambers, the remote farmhouses purchased in secret. Thus, the bowls of cold porridge and the footsteps that never stopped to speak. Each child hidden away was not only a victim of parental fear but also of an empire's need to prove itself flawless. And so the story expands beyond one boy in Vienna. It becomes a pattern etched across Europe's marble floors. In Britain, in France, in Russia, Spain, and the Ottoman court alike, the same calculations repeated. Palaces hid their shadows, and in doing so, revealed more about themselves than they ever intended. The weight of bloodlines was heavy enough to erase voices before they had the chance to form. It is in this weight, in the fear of imperfection, the terror of exposure, that we begin to see how the lives of children became casualties of dynastic arithmetic. From here, we will follow those shadows into specific lives. We will see what became of these hidden children, not only in Vienna, but in Britain's countryside, France's palaces, and Russia's frozen gardens. We will listen for what remains of them, piecing together fragments preserved by those who dared, quietly, to remember. Prince John was born into the heart of the British Empire at the dawn of the 20th century, a time when royal images were as carefully curated as the uniforms of soldiers on parade. The year was 1905, and his father, King George V, was still a prince. His mother, the future Queen Mary, carried the weight of an empire on her shoulders even before the crown was set upon her head. In those early years, nothing seemed amiss. Photographs show a round-faced boy in sailor suits, nestled among his siblings, smiling with the earnest openness of childhood. At Sandringham, in York Cottage, he appeared like any other royal child, presented to dignitaries, paraded for the camera, a visible token of continuity for the dynasty. But time revealed a different story. Around his 4th year, seizures struck like thieves in the night, reshaping his world in ways medicine could not master. Epilepsy, doctors whispered already enough to stir unease in an era where the condition was poorly understood and often associated with madness or weakness. Alongside the fits came something subtler, but just as alarming to a family obsessed with decorum. Learning difficulties, a slower pace of speech, movements that seemed clumsy to eyes trained to expect polish. Those who look now at photographs from the era, trained by later knowledge, recognize features that suggest Down syndrome. His condition was never named. Officially, silence was the royal remedy, but the signs linger in the images like an unacknowledged ghost. By 1909, the smiling boy vanished from public life. No announcements were made, no explanations offered. Royal children were meant to embody promise. John's presence in the spotlight had become a liability. He was quietly relocated to Wood Farm, a modest house on the Sandringham estate, far enough to shield him from the gaze of cameras and foreign courts, but near enough to maintain control. There, under the care of his nurse, Charlotte Lala Bill, John lived a life that drifted far from the grandeur of Windsor or Buckingham. His grandmother, Queen Alexandra, visited him there. In her diary she called him poor little Johnny, but her words capture more than pity. She described his fascination with simple things, collecting acorns in the garden, laughing at games he invented for himself, finding delight in patterns that others dismissed. He loved the gardener's work, watched the shifting light, laughed at animals with a joy unmediated by protocol. In Wood Farm's quieter rooms, stripped of court expectations, he created a private kingdom of acorns, birds, and laughter. Yet even there, separation remained the rule. His siblings were discouraged from visiting. The family, who displayed warmth and affection in photographs with their other children, maintained a distance from John. In their letters and official words, affection rarely surfaced. Instead, duty spoke through them. The boy was cared for, provided for, but kept apart. In an empire where even children were instruments of diplomacy, John was reduced to a silence carefully preserved. When he died suddenly in 1919 at the age of 13, after a severe seizure, the reaction from his family reflected that same duality of care and erasure. Queen Mary, his mother, wrote to a friend that his death was a great release for the poor little boy. Release, the word carries both tenderness and dismissal, acknowledging his suffering while also implying that his absence was a kind of mercy for everyone. It was not grief that resonated through her words, but relief, an echo of centuries of royal families confronted with children who could not embody their dynastic ideals. And yet, against the weight of silence, another narrative persisted. Lala Bill, his nurse, kept his drawings, his little treasures, photographs that showed not an embarrassment, but a boy with joy and curiosity. She preserved a memory that stood in quiet defiance of the official line, a reminder that John was not a burden or a symbol of failure, but a child who loved, laughed, and created in the small ways children do. His story, though comparatively recent, feels ancient in its echoes. The words release and mercy, chosen by his royal mother and grandmother, reverberate backward across the centuries, aligning with letters and diaries in which other royal families spoke of hidden children. They reveal a worldview where difference equaled suffering, where a life unable to fulfill dynastic duty was deemed incomplete. And yet, in the margins, through the love of nurses, servants, or an occasional compassionate relative, we glimpse another truth. These children were not shadows, but people whose joy radiated despite confinement. Prince John's short life shows us the pivot between eras. His condition was never named, his presence was hidden, But unlike some of his forgotten counterparts centuries before, there remained photographs, diaries, and artifacts. His memory did not vanish into ash. His nurse's devotion, his grandmother's words, even the guarded phrasing of Queen Mary, all ensure he was not entirely erased. In John, the pattern of concealment continued, but with cracks wide enough for history to look through, and in those cracks, we see not just John, but the whole architecture of secrecy that monarchies built around imperfection. His laughter at Wood Farm, echoing across empty fields, reminds us that behind every erased name or abandoned portrait was a life no arithmetic of bloodlines could truly measure. The French court of the mid-17th century prided itself on grandeur. Louis XIII and his queen, Anne of Austria, had struggled for years to produce heirs, and when a child was finally born in 1648, anticipation filled the galleries of Fontainebleau. Midwives hurried, courtiers waited, and chroniclers sharpened their quills, prepared to announce another jewel in the crown of Bourbon continuity. Yet the infant who arrived was different. Official records described him vaguely as weak, a child who failed to thrive. Within weeks, the notices became more final. He had died, they wrote, a sad but unsurprising outcome in an age of high infant mortality. The court moved on, preparing the stage for the future Sun King, Louis XIV, but behind the polished facade, whispers coiled through the corridors. Private letters exchanged between physicians, preserved in the Vatican archives centuries later, speak of a boy whose features did not fit royal expectations. They noted the flatness of the nasal bridge, the single crease across his small palm, the tongue that pressed forward as though struggling to find room in a too small mouth. These details, unremarkable to us now except as markers of Down syndrome, were to them signs of divine displeasure. The baby lived for 43 days. 43 days of anxious vigils, of priests summoned to perform extra blessings, of a queen slipping into chapels at night to light candles in desperation. His wet nurse, interrogated again and again, swore that she had fed him properly, held him properly, done nothing to anger God. But someone had to be at fault. The monarchy, so convinced of its sacred blood, could not imagine that nature itself had simply varied. And so blame fell upon servants, upon stars, upon the sins of kings. Anne of Austria, fiercely devout, ordered special prayers at shrines, pilgrimages to intercede for her child. Rumors rippled outward. Perhaps this was punishment for the king's rumored infidelities, or for the queen's foreign blood. Others, more superstitious, pointed to the night sky at the moment of conception, reading planetary alignments like a court ledger of destiny. Few dared say aloud what the physicians feared in private, that this child was not a curse, but simply different, marked by a condition none of them understood. 43 days, long enough for attendants to note how the infant clutched a finger with surprising strength, long enough for a mother to recognize the sound of his breathing in the night, and then the sound was gone. The court recorded only that the child had died and was buried quietly. His name, if he had been given one, was erased from official genealogies. Portraitists packed away their brushes, chroniclers closed their books, but silence leaves traces. One physician, writing years later in coded Latin, described the case as an infant prince whose visage bore the signs of a Mongolian character, a phrase centuries before John Langdon Down would coin his clinical description. The language reveals not just the limitations of science but also the urgency with which these doctors sought explanations, however crude. In their notes, we glimpse the first stirrings of recognition that what they saw was not punishment but pattern. Still, the 17th century had no space for such nuance. Infant deaths were common, but royal infant deaths demanded reasons. The myth of divine right could not be compromised by chance, and so the child became a ghost almost before he had lived, folded into a narrative of sin, blood, and celestial portents. For us, looking back, the story is unbearably human. A baby born into the highest chambers of Europe survived only a matter of weeks, but those weeks revealed a chasm between private grief and public image. Behind the frescoed ceilings of Fontainebleau, a mother prayed over her fragile son. Outside, courtiers spun theories, servants defended themselves, priests debated theology. The baby himself, innocent of politics, lay swaddled in silence until silence claimed him entirely. This short life, so quickly hidden, foreshadows the pattern repeated across dynasties. Children whose differences exposed the fault lines in systems obsessed with perfection. They remind us that monarchies, for all their pageantry, could be undone by something as small as a crease across a palm, and they show us how quickly love was forced to surrender to politics, how a family's grief was twisted into a narrative of blame and divine retribution. In France, the court moved forward, polishing the legend of Louis XIV, the radiant Sun King, until his brilliance seemed to banish shadows. But in those shadows lay the memory of a lost infant, a child who never had the chance to be anything other than a problem to be explained away. Russia at the twilight of the 19th century was a land that cloaked itself in grandeur and paranoia alike. The Romanovs glittered in uniform and jewels, presenting themselves as pillars of unshakable authority, yet behind the facades of the Alexander Palace lay rooms where whispers lived longer than children. One such whisper concerned the youngest daughter of Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich, born in 1882. In official genealogies, her name never appeared. Records list only sons and titled daughters, and yet, payroll ledgers tell another story. For 16 years after her supposed early death, stipends continued to be paid to a cluster of servants assigned to the East Wing nursery. Money that should have stopped with an infant's funeral flowed on, month after month, year after year, in letters exchanged between ladies in waiting, later discovered in family archives smuggled abroad during the Revolution. We glimpse her outline. They describe a girl who never quite entered the world expected of her. At 14, she still played with dolls meant for toddlers, still struggled to form clear words, still needed watchful eyes to keep her from wandering out into the frozen gardens in her nightgown, laughing at snowflakes, as if each flake had been made solely for her delight. This daughter was never presented at court, never painted into portraits, never allowed into the ceremonial life of St. Petersburg. Her existence, half acknowledged in private, denied in public, was contained to that East Wing, a gilded cage, softened only by the affections of servants who tended her. They wrote of her laughter, her simple kindness, her eagerness to embrace anyone who came near. These qualities, to them, were not weaknesses, but a kind of innocence, untouched by court intrigue. Yet to the dynasty, such innocence threatened everything. Then came 1917. Revolution swept across Russia like fire through dry grass, consuming palaces and altars alike. In the chaos, the carefully maintained secrecy collapsed. Some claim soldiers found her there, bewildered by the shouting, clinging to her dolls as if they might restore normalcy. Others believe loyal attendants spirited her away into the countryside, where she might live unnoticed among villagers who would see her not as a failed princess but simply as a woman-child who loved snow. And darker rumors persist, that in the desperate flight of the Romanovs, choices were made about who could be saved and who was too great a burden to bring along. History draws a veil at this point. No official documents name her fate. When revolutionaries stormed palaces, they were meticulous in cataloguing treasures, but human lives, especially inconvenient ones, were easy to overlook or erase. Was she hidden in some remote monastery, her royal origins disguised even from those who fed her? Did she die in the East Wing amid the chaos, her body unrecorded in the lists of the fallen? Or did she wander into obscurity, surviving in some forgotten village where no one ever knew that the laughing girl with the broken speech carried the blood of Tsars? What we do know is that she vanished from history as completely as though she had never been born. The Romanovs left behind endless photographs of dinners, parades, glittering gowns, but none of her. In the family tree, her branch is simply absent, and yet the traces remain. The payments to servants, the letters of exasperated but fond attendants, the rumors preserved in memoirs. Together they weave the silhouette of a girl who lived not as a princess but as a secret. Her story is emblematic of the Romanov world, a dynasty that could not reconcile fragility with its cult of divine strength. Hemophilia in the Tsarevich Alexei became a national crisis precisely because it was public, impossible to hide. But the unnamed daughter, born with what we now recognize as Down syndrome, could be concealed, and so concealment became her destiny. It is tempting to romanticize her, imagining her watching snowfall, chasing birds across palace lawns, finding joy in small things while the empire rumbled toward collapse. But to do so risks ignoring the loneliness, the confinement, the decision that her life was too inconvenient for the narrative of power. She lived, but in silence. She may have survived the revolution, or she may have died in it. But either way, her story reminds us of how easily entire lives can be erased when they do not fit the script of history. The Romanovs are remembered for their violent end in Yekaterinburg, for Anastasia's ghost stories, for Fabergé eggs and glittering coronations. But in their hidden daughter, we see another tragedy, the quiet disappearance of a child who was denied even her name. Her absence tells us as much about the empire's fragility as any assassination or rebellion. She was proof that royal blood could not protect against the randomness of birth, and so she was made invisible. And yet, invisibility does not erase existence. Somewhere in memories, in letters, in the snowfall she once laughed at, her life lingers, a reminder that history's margins often hold truths that the main text cannot bear to admit. Spain in the 17th century was a dynasty gnawing on itself. The Habsburgs, desperate to preserve pure blood, had tangled their family tree into knots of cousine marriages and uncle-niece unions. Portraits from this era show stiff faces framed in lace ruffs, but the eyes often betray exhaustion. The most infamous of these heirs, Charles II, became known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. His jaw jutted so far forward he could barely chew. He did not speak until age 4. He was a king in name but a child in mind, manipulated by factions who treated him as both sacred relic and political puppet. Charles survives in history books, but his was only the most visible case. Beneath the surface, a darker record runs. Physicians at court wrote in code, concealing their observations in Latin, disguising truth behind layers of euphemism. Their notes speak of infants born with Mongolic features, a term centuries premature, describing the almond eyes, the small stature, the slowness of development that we now recognize as Down syndrome. These children were rarely baptized with pomp. Many never received names at all. To the public, they simply did not exist, and yet some records escaped erasure. In 1693, a physician named Diego Mateo Zapata committed something dangerous to paper. He described a young princess, her name later scratched from the genealogies, who struggled to swallow food, who remained tiny for her age, who never learned to speak in full sentences. But Zapata also wrote something else, something that set him apart from his colleagues. He noted her extraordinary affection, how she reached out to embrace anyone who approached, how her joy at hearing music seemed boundless, how she would clap her hands and sway even if she could not follow rhythm. For him, she was not cursed. She was a variation, a mystery perhaps, but not a sin. Such words were perilous. In an empire where priests and physicians alike were expected to reinforce divine narratives, to suggest that a royal child marked by difference might still be worthy of love was heresy. Zapata paid for his compassion with his career and, eventually, his life condemned by the Inquisition, his writings confiscated, his name consigned to flames along with heresy and dissent. Yet he had already hidden his notes in the false bottom of a medical text, where they survived centuries until rediscovered in 1954. Imagine the risk of even writing those words. To see joy where others saw shame was to undermine the entire architecture of Habsburg legitimacy. For the Spanish court, every child was proof of divine favor or divine wrath. A healthy son meant God smiled on Spain. A daughter with slanted eyes and gentle laughter threatened the idea that Habsburg blood was superior to all others. If nature produced such children among peasants, that was one thing. But among those who claimed the right to rule nations, it shook the foundation of their myth. Whispers spread, as they always did. Servants spoke of infants who were baptized privately at night, then declared dead the next morning. Midwives were interrogated, accused of negligence. Priests performed exorcisms in chambers that smelled of incense and fear. A dynasty obsessed with omens turned these children into evidence. Proof of Spain's decline, God's judgment, the cost of too much pride. No one said aloud the simpler truth that nature delights in variation, and that no family, no matter how gilded, is exempt. The Habsburgs' obsession with blood purity was their undoing. Cousins who shared too many ancestors produced children whose health cracked under the weight of those unions. Still, they clung to the illusion that keeping the line unmixed preserved strength. The irony is cruel. Their attempt at control only deepened their fragility. Charles II, sickly and childless, marked the end of Spain's Habsburg line. His body carried the history of generations of choices, written in bone and blood, and behind him, hidden in convent records, in coded physician notes, in the memories of servants who dared not speak, were the other children, the erased ones. Girls who loved music but never spoke. Boys who wandered palace gardens with vacant eyes. Infants who lived only days, but whose features frightened their royal parents into silence. They were the unacknowledged proof that royal blood was no shield against the unpredictability of life. The Spanish court believed itself bewitched, cursed by dark forces. In truth, they were betrayed by their own myth, the belief that breeding could command perfection. Those children, hidden and unnamed, exposed the chasm between appearance and reality. For while Spain's kings and queens sat beneath portraits of divine grandeur, their palaces contained rooms filled with silence and secrets where joy still flickered, even if no one dared admit it. The Ottomans ruled from domes of dazzling blue and courtyards echoing with fountains, but behind the magnificence of Topkapi Palace lurked one of history's most chilling institutions, the kafes, the cage. It was not a prison in chains and iron bars, but a velvet enclosure where potential heirs were kept in silence, each breath weighed against the possibility of succession. It was here, according to scattered records and the memoirs of a guard, that a hidden prince lived out his life, 23 years of existence behind latticed windows. This boy, born during the reign of Mehmed III, at the turn of the 17th century, entered the world already marked. Physicians noticed at once the softness of his features, the almond-shaped eyes, the slower movements. What we would recognize today as Down syndrome was, in the Ottoman court, something far more dangerous. A sign of weakness in a system where princes were expected to be warriors, poets, scholars, embodiments of imperial strength. In a dynasty where brothers had once strangled each other for the throne, a child unable to wield power was not only useless but a liability. The official story claimed he died young, as so many fragile infants did. But records of provisions tell another tale. Year after year, supplies of food, oil lamps, and cloth were sent to a specific room in the cafes. The entries continue for more than 2 decades, far too long for a child who was supposedly buried in infancy. Guards, writing later in their private recollections, spoke of strange sounds from that chamber. Not the muttering of ambitious prisoners plotting their ascension, but repetitive songs sung in a high, unsteady voice, followed by bursts of laughter at odd hours of the night. When Sultan Ahmed I died in 1617 and succession chaos erupted, the cafes was opened to account for all potential heirs. Among the rooms, one astonished the guards. Inside, they found not a prince sharpening ambition, but a man with the mind of a child. Surrounded by thousands of shards of colored glass, he had arranged in intricate mosaics across the floor. Where others spent their confinement plotting, he had spent his life creating patterns that only he could understand. Art made of fragments, brilliant but unseen. He greeted the guards with laughter, humming songs no one else recognized. What happened to him afterward is a silence history has never broken. The memoir of one guard ends with that single description, as though to record more would be dangerous. Did the new sultan order his death, considering him unfit and unnecessary? Was he quietly removed to another chamber, his glass mosaics scattered and swept away? Or did some servant pity him, spiriting him out of the palace to live anonymously, free at last from walls that had known only secrets? We cannot know. The empire, careful to record jewels, palaces, and battles, left no space for the truth of a life that did not fit the script of power. The tragedy of his story lies not only in confinement but in what it reveals about the Ottoman succession system. Where European dynasties hid children to protect reputations, the Ottomans had institutionalized brutality. Brothers murdered brothers. Weakness meant execution. The caves itself was supposed to be mercy compared to strangulation, yet for this prince, mercy became a slow erasure, a life lived in solitude, his only companions, the shifting light on glass fragments, his own voice echoing against carved stone. Imagine him there, day after day arranging colors, turning shards of broken bottles into patterns that glowed when sunlight angled through the lattice. No courtiers to applaud, no chroniclers to record, only a guard glancing through a door and quickly looking away. In that strange chamber, beauty bloomed unseen, joy flickered where politics saw only liability. He may have been dismissed as weak, but in his mosaics we glimpse resilience, the human impulse to create even when no one is watching. Then the door closed again, and silence swallowed him. His story, like the glass on his floor, fractured into fragments scattered through history, leaving us to piece together the shape of a life never meant to be remembered. In Bavaria, the Wittelsbach dynasty carried its own burden of secrets, but unlike the brutal Ottoman cafes, theirs were buried in softer walls, corridors hushed not by chains but by silence. It was in the year 1826 that Princess Alexandra was born, cousin to the eccentric King Ludwig II's line, and from the very beginning she was marked as different. Official records state she died at the age of 3, a convenient end that excused her absence from portraits and processions. Yet the palace accounts tell another story. For a quarter of a century, payments continued for the quiet wing of Nymphenburg Palace. Servants assigned to this wing received wages long after the supposed funeral, and food and clothing were requisitioned in amounts that no dead child could consume. It was as if the bureaucracy itself, unable to lie completely, betrayed the charade. Then, in 1923, a governess's diary surfaced in the Bavarian State Library. Her words peeled away the facade with astonishing tenderness. She wrote of Alexandra not as a ghost to be hidden, but as a young woman she cared for. Today, at 25 years, she learned to feed herself with the spoon. She beamed as though she had conquered the world. Another entry speaks of teaching her to recognize letters, though the governess admits she never formed words from them. Progress came in tiny increments, but each victory holding a comb, fastening a button was celebrated in that hidden corner of the palace. Alexandra's greatest joy, the diary reveals, came from her canaries. She sits for hours, the governess recorded, listening to their songs. She sings with them, though no melody is true, yet the delight in her eyes is purer than any opera. In these passages, we see not a cursed royal, not an embarrassment to be buried, but a human being whose pleasures were simple and whose affection was constant. And yet, for all this tenderness, the conditions of her existence remained cruel. She could live, but only out of sight. She could laugh, but never at a banquet. She could love her canaries, but never stand in line for succession or appear in portraits. Her name was absent from royal registers, her existence denied whenever public scrutiny drew near. She was permitted life, but not presence. The governess herself seemed to understand the paradox. Her entries alternate between affection and resignation, between describing Alexandra's joy and lamenting the secrecy that kept her invisible. She smiles when I enter, one passage reads, but I am ashamed that only I may see it. That shame, unspoken in public, remained a private wound in the servant's words. When Alexandra died around the age of 25, her funeral bore no resemblance to royal custom. There were no horse-drawn carriages, no solemn processions through Munich's streets. She was interred quietly in an unmarked section of the family crypt, her death noted only in household accounts that ceased their payments. Official biographies still repeated the fiction that the princess had died at 3 years old, a brief and forgettable life. But the governess's diary restores her to us. Through its pages, Alexandra emerges as a woman whose life was confined yet meaningful, whose joys, canaries, songs, small triumphs of independence shine through the dark cloak of concealment. Her existence, denied to history, is rescued by the words of someone who refused to forget. In her story, we glimpse a contradiction as sharp as any in these chronicles. The palace that deemed her unfit to be seen nonetheless preserved her for decades, cared for her body even as it erased her name. Compassion and cruelty intertwined, producing a life both protected and denied. The quiet wing of Nymphenburg was no dungeon, but its silence carried a weight as heavy as iron. Alexandra's laughter, echoing in those rooms, was never meant to travel beyond them. And yet, 2 centuries later, through the ink of a governess's hand, it does. Portugal in the 18th century was a kingdom polished by gold from Brazil, its churches heavy with gilded altars, its kings eager to display divine favor through magnificence. When Infanta Maria Francisca was born in 1734 to King João V and Queen Maria Anna of Austria, the court prepared to do what it always did, immortalize the child in paint. Royal births demanded portraits, small canvases sent to foreign courts as announcements of vitality and alliances. An artist was summoned, John Rank, a painter of solid reputation, to capture the infant princess's likeness. But the commission never reached completion. Rank abandoned Lisbon abruptly, the payment unfinished, the sketches destroyed. Years later, in Madrid, on his deathbed, the painter confessed to a priest what had haunted him. I could not paint innocence in a way His Majesty would accept. The child was innocent, but not as power demanded it. His words suggest what the surviving convent records confirm, that Maria Francisca bore the signs we now recognize as Down syndrome. At court, whispers spread quickly. The royal family, so invested in displays of strength and divine blessing, could not risk presenting an image that might invite doubt. A princess who could not be paraded at processions, who might never speak clearly or learn the elaborate gestures of diplomacy, threatened Portugal's standing in Europe. The portrait was cancelled, and with it the possibility of her public existence. Instead, Maria Francisca was removed quietly to the convent of Santo Novo in Lisbon. Officially, she was there for education and devotion. In truth, the convent became her world. The nuns, accustomed to caring for orphans and the sick, embraced her without the burdens of dynastic shame. Their records describe a child who loved to mimic their prayers, singing sounds without words, clapping her hands at the rise and fall of their chants. She took joy in small duties, folding altar cloths, feeding the convent's chickens, carrying baskets of bread. In these humble tasks, she found purpose. The contrast is striking. In the palace, she was an embarrassment to be erased. In the convent, she became God's child, a soul to be cared for without politics. The sisters did not speak of curses or divine wrath. Instead, they noted her delight in the rhythm of bells, her fascination with colored glass windows, her laughter at the rustle of habits when the wind caught their folds. She was not a pawn to them, nor a shame, but a presence. For 11 years she lived in that quiet rhythm. Then, in 1745, fever struck. The nuns recorded her final days with tenderness. How she hummed even as her strength waned. How she clutched a small wooden crucifix with surprising firmness. How they prayed over her bed until her breathing slowed. When she died, they petitioned the crown to let her be buried in their cemetery rather than return to the royal pantheon. The request was granted with almost indecent haste, as if the court was eager to wash its hands of her memory. Her grave marker still exists in the convent grounds, though worn by centuries. It reads only, Deus's Filha, God's child. No name, no titles, no dates, just a phrase that stripped her of dynastic burden and, in its simplicity, acknowledged her humanity more fully than any royal decree. Her story carries both tragedy and a strange mercy. Tragedy, because she was denied her place in the royal family, erased from portraits, and hidden from the public eye. Mercy, because in the convent she was loved as herself, not as a failed emblem of power. Her laughter echoed not in gilded halls but in cloisters, where the measure of a soul was not its political utility but its capacity for joy. The unfinished portrait and the nameless grave together symbolized the tension at the heart of royal secrecy. To the court, she was a problem to conceal. To the nuns, she was simply a child. Between those two worlds, Maria Francisca lived her short life, forgotten by the dynasty that bore her but remembered quietly, faithfully by those who folded altar cloths beside her. Denmark in the early 19th century was a kingdom anxious about its place in Europe. Wars had left scars, borders shifted like sand, and the monarchy, like all monarchies, needed to appear steady, blessed, untouchable. So when Prince Gustav, born in 1803 to King Frederick VI, showed signs of being different, the Danish court invented a fiction to protect itself. Officially, Gustav was delicate, afflicted by a nervous condition that required constant travel for his health. Couriers carried reports that he had gone to the seaside for air, to the mountains for rest, to spa towns for treatments. His absence from public life was thus explained not by shame, but by an endless pilgrimage of convalescence. To the people, he was a fragile prince who wandered Europe in search of wellness. In reality, he never left Denmark's borders. He was quietly moved between remote estates and secluded royal properties, each chosen for its isolation. The fiction was so elaborate that even members of foreign courts believed they had narrowly missed his visits, as though he were always just out of reach. Behind this charade, a smaller, more human story unfolded. Gustav did not study Latin declensions or the intricacies of diplomacy, as his brothers did. Instead, his tutors, who were in truth his guardians, taught him simple skills: how to dress himself, how to eat neatly, how to recognize letters even if he could not form words into sentences. For a time, he struggled even with these, but there were sparks of ability that astonished those patient enough to see them. One of those tutors, Hans Eriksson, left behind letters that survived in the Danish archives. They reveal a man torn between duty to the royal charade and affection for the boy he came to know. Eriksson wrote of Gustav's peculiar gifts. The prince, he said, had perfect recall of faces. Once he met a servant, he never forgot them, Even years later, he could sense changes in the weather hours before they occurred, staring at the sky with an intensity that unsettled those around him, then announcing in his own halting way that rain or wind was coming. Even more mysterious, he seemed to know when people were lying. Eriksson described moments when Gustav would turn away suddenly from courtiers and mutter, "Not true," in his broken Danish. Eriksson wrestled with what to make of these abilities. In one letter he asked, almost plaintively, "Is not this also intelligence? Perhaps we measure too narrowly. Perhaps the prince sees patterns I cannot." It was a radical thought in an age when intelligence was judged by letters learned and Latin recited. To suggest that a mind deemed deficient might in fact possess its own order of brilliance bordered on heresy. But the Danish court had no interest in such redefinitions. For them, Gustav's life was a problem to be managed, not a mystery to be explored. The fiction of travel was easier than the truth. His tutors submitted reports of progress in studies fabrications to match the narrative, while in private they taught him to button his coat, to pour water without spilling. In the end, the fiction endured longer than the boy. Gustav died at the age of 31, officially from pneumonia, but letters suggest it was likely a heart condition common in people with Down syndrome. His death was announced as occurring abroad during one of his supposed health treatments. In truth, his body was returned under cover of night to Denmark and buried before dawn. The royal genealogies reduced his entire existence to a line: Prince Gustav died abroad, 1834. No mention of his peculiar gifts, his laughter, his struggles, his tutors' doubts. No trace of the boy who loved to watch clouds until he could predict the storm. Yet Eriksson's letters survive, and in them, Gustav remains. A child whose intelligence did not match the court's definitions, but who grasped truths in ways others could not. A boy hidden beneath the fiction of endless travel, who in his quiet life forced at least one man to question what it really means to be intelligent, to be human. Sweden's royal family in the mid-19th century was still new to the business of monarchy, its Bernadotte dynasty barely 2 generations old. They sought legitimacy in the trappings of European courts, stiff uniforms, solemn portraits, glittering ceremonies keen to prove themselves no less divine than the ancient houses around them. But legitimacy could not be painted into existence, and when difference appeared within their bloodline, they reached for the same tool as the others: erasure. Prince Carl Oscar was born in 1852. Son of Crown Prince Charles, later Charles XV. His baptism was celebrated with pomp, but soon afterward the child vanished from public record. Official documents declare he died 3 months after birth. The public nodded, mourned politely, and moved on. A royal infant dead in infancy was nothing unusual in the 19th century. But what if it was not the whole truth? Years later, fragments began to surface. Servant testimonies, physician bills, requisitions for food and clothing, all extending years beyond the supposed death, suggest that the prince lived on, not 3 months but at least 9 years. The palace at Tullgarn, some 30 miles outside Stockholm, emerges in these records as his place of concealment. And then there is the memoir of a groundskeeper's son, written in his old age. He recalled playing in the palace gardens as a child and encountering a strange boy. The boy could not speak but laughed constantly, a laugh that rang through the hedges and startled birds into flight. He feared nothing, ran straight to the bees' nests, crouched by the ponds without caution, watched ant colonies for hours as though they were miniature kingdoms. He seemed, in the memoirist's words, a happy ghost, appearing only when the royal family was away, vanishing days before their return. The memory haunted him. Only decades later, after hearing rumors of a hidden prince, did he realize who the boy might have been. His memoir records the uncanny quality of those meetings. A royal child, flesh and blood, living a shadow existence within palace walls, present yet invisible. Officially, Carl Oscar had no life beyond his 3 months. Unofficially, he may have lived nearly a decade in seclusion, allowed to laugh in gardens but never to appear in portraits. His existence was a contradiction the court could not resolve. To acknowledge him would be to admit imperfection in the bloodline. To deny him was to sentence him to the half-life of secrecy. Imagine the boy crouched among the ants, his laughter filling the gardens, while carriages rattled past carrying his family to ceremonies in Stockholm. Imagine the palace servants who fed him, clothed him, and kept his secret, knowing that to speak the truth was to risk their livelihoods. His life became a ghost story because ghostliness was the only role permitted to him. In the end, whether he died at 9, as some records imply, or earlier, as the official version insists, Karl Oskar embodies the cruel arithmetic of monarchy. A living child could be written out of existence with a line of ink. His laughter could echo in gardens, yet vanish from the pages of history. And so the groundskeeper's son remembered him. A boy who should have been a prince but lived as a secret. A ghost whose joy was real even if his life was erased. Austria-Hungary, 1868. Archduke Karl Ludwig, brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, welcomed the birth of a son. For a few hours, the court seemed prepared to celebrate another healthy branch on the imperial family tree. But within a day, the story changed. The child, they said, had been stillborn. No funeral, no public mourning. Only the hurried finality of absence. The mother, told her baby never drew breath, was left to grieve a phantom. Yet somewhere in the folds of Vienna's vast clerical machinery, a midwife kept a secret. In her diary later discovered in a trunk during the Second World War, when her descendants fled bombing, she recorded the truth. The infant lived. He breathed, cried, reached for the breast. But his features made the emperor himself recoil. Within hours, he was taken from his mother. She was told he had died. The boy was carried not to a crypt but to a monastery outside Vienna, where the brothers were paid discreetly to raise him as an orphan. They gave him a new name, Felix the Happy One. And in their chronicles, we glimpse a different life than the palace had ever allowed. Felix never wore silks or paraded through marble halls. Instead, he swept cloisters, carried water buckets, fed chickens, rang bells for prayer. He never mastered reading, but he learned the rhythm of the Psalms by heart, humming along even when the Latin eluded him. The brothers wrote of his joy, how he clapped when the organ swelled, how he laughed at the rustle of leaves in autumn courtyards, how he would stop in wonder at shafts of light striking coloured glass windows. They saw no curse in him, they saw innocence. One monk noted that Felix, though limited in speech, seemed to sense moods with uncanny clarity. He would sit beside a grieving brother in silence, offering a hand or a smile until tears subsided. He is closer to God than we are, the abbot once wrote, because he knows no malice. In a world where imperial bloodlines demanded strength and ambition, Felix embodied something different, a holiness born of simplicity, a joy that needed no justification. He lived among them for 12 years. In 1880, scarlet fever swept through the monastery, and Felix fell ill. The brothers nursed him as best they could. But his heart, already fragile, could not withstand the fever. He died surrounded not by courtiers, but by men who loved him. The monastery's chronicle recorded his death with a tenderness denied to most princes. Our Felix has returned to God, who surely loves him better than the world ever could. Back in Vienna, there was no announcement, no mourning in the imperial press. For the palace, Felix had died before he lived. But in the monastery, bells tolled for him, prayers were sung for him, and his memory remained in the margins of their records. His story is one of betrayal and redemption. Betrayal, because his mother was denied the truth, condemned to mourn a child she never lost. Redemption, because in the monastery he was allowed a kind of life, a circle of care, and a name Felix that honoured what the palace had denied. Through him, we glimpse the cruel calculus of monarchy, how a child who did not fit could be erased from one world but embraced in another. And we see, too, how love and dignity often survived in the places least expected among monks who saw not a failed heir, but a soul as luminous as stained glass in morning light. Prussia at the turn of the 20th century stood tall in steel and uniform, an empire marching toward modernity with mechanical precision. Yet behind the discipline and ceremony, its royal family carried shadows no less heavy than the Habsburgs or Bourbons. Among those shadows was Prince Waldemar, nephew of Kaiser Wilhelm II, born in 1889 to the Kaiser's sister. Officially, he scarcely existed. His name appears rarely, if at all, in family registers, but fragments, letters, memoirs, whispers reveal a child hidden away in quiet rooms, cared for but denied acknowledgement. What remains of him comes not from palaces or genealogies, but from the devotion of one woman, his nurse, Emma Müller. Unlike courtiers who measured children by their political worth, Emma saw Waldemar as he was eager, gentle, alive with curiosity. and she did something audacious. Every year on his birthday, she commissioned a local artist to paint his portrait. 17 portraits in all, each showing him as he grew, from wide-eyed boy to youth, then to a man whose features bore the unmistakable signs of Down syndrome. His eyes, almond-shaped and luminous, his smile, hesitant but sincere, each canvas, an act of resistance against erasure. Through these portraits, a different Waldemar emerges than the one official history tried to hide. Emma's letters, discovered after her death, describe a boy who adored trains, able to identify every locomotive by sight and sound, who listened for bird calls and named them with unerring accuracy, who could memorize entire orchestral pieces after hearing them once. He was not less than, she wrote again and again. He was different than, and in God's eyes, different is not wrong, but Emma's defiance carried risks. After Waldemar's death in 1906, she tried to give the portraits to his mother, hoping they would preserve his memory. Instead, they were rejected, worse burned, one by one, before her eyes, reduced to ash in the name of royal discretion. The last tangible evidence of his life, gone in a blaze of silence. Emma herself was cast aside, her wages ended, her years of devotion repaid with dismissal. It is difficult to read her letters without hearing the rawness of her grief. She had preserved him in art, year by year, as he grew into a man no court wanted to acknowledge. She had imagined, perhaps, that someday those paintings would prove he had existed, that he had been loved. To watch them burn must have felt like losing him twice, and yet, her words remain. Through them, Waldemar escapes the obliteration his family sought. We see not a royal embarrassment but a human being who found joy in rhythm, in engines, in songbirds. A man whose difference sharpened his gifts in ways few recognized. A hidden prince who lived and laughed, even if his laughter was not welcome in gilded halls. His story embodies the tragedy of memory denied. The empire that paraded its might in spiked helmets and iron discipline could not bear the softness of a son who loved music and trains. But through Emma's quiet rebellion, through the portraits that once existed, we glimpse him still like a melody half-remembered, a train's whistle fading into distance. For Waldemar, the tragedy was not only his erasure, but the deliberate destruction of his image. Yet the defiance of one nurse, who dared to commission those portraits in secret, ensures that his life cannot be wholly forgotten. Against an empire's silence, Emma Müller's love speaks still. Italy's royal house, the House of Savoy, was unlike many of Europe's older dynasties. Its power was younger, born out of the patchwork unification of a nation, and it often felt the need to prove itself as modern, progressive, less bound to the ossified rituals of the past. Yet even here, where change was possible, difference still had to be managed. Princess Giovanna, born in 1879, was not hidden away in total silence like so many of her counterparts. The Savoys attempted a compromise. She would be seen, but only on carefully controlled terms. Official announcements described her as delicate, too frail for the demands of long ceremonies, and so she appeared occasionally at public events, always at a distance, always rehearsed. For weeks before each appearance, tutors and attendants coached her. How to wave, when to smile, how long to stand still. She was taught to endure a few minutes of scrutiny before being whisked back into the protective shadows of the palace. The public accepted the explanation. A fragile princess, too sensitive for the rigors of court, such things could happen, after all. But behind that narrative lay the truth we can now glimpse through household records and private correspondence. Giovanna lived with a developmental condition recognizable today as Down syndrome. Unlike many hidden royals, she was given a fuller life. Her tutors learned to adapt to her strengths. She possessed an extraordinary memory for music. She could repeat melodies after hearing them only a few times. Rhythm anchored her, so lessons and tasks were often taught through song and repetition. She also had a remarkable affinity for animals, especially the palace dogs and horses. Servants wrote of how she could calm even the most restless colt by simply standing beside it, humming softly. Her world was not broad, but it was rich in its own way. Within the palace, she had a small circle of servants and companions who spoke to her not as a secret, but as a person. Letters describe her delight in small rituals, feeding treats to the hounds, clapping along to piano lessons, memorizing the sequence of bells in the nearby chapel. She learned enough words to communicate her needs, and enough gestures to express her joy. Yet even this relative kindness bore the mark of exclusion. Giovanna could live, but not fully. She could be acknowledged, but not celebrated. Her appearances were short, her image carefully guarded. She existed at the edge of visibility, her life a constant negotiation between the dynasty's need for perfection and its hesitant compassion. When she died at 33, her funeral was private but dignified. No grand procession, no public mourning. Yet within the family, her uncle, King Berto I, is said to have remarked, "She lived as God made her, and that was enough." It was not a declaration of pride, but it was at least an acknowledgement of worth, an acknowledgement most royal children in her position never received. Giovanna's story, then, is one of rare mercy within an often merciless pattern. Where others were erased, she was at least allowed a space narrow, controlled, but real. She experienced music, animals, affection, and the occasional sunlight of public life. Her existence reminds us that even within the rigid walls of monarchy, moments of humanity could break through, however imperfectly. And yet, her life also underscores the paradox, that to be seen at all, she had to be rehearsed, controlled, choreographed into acceptability. Freedom was not given, only glimpsed. Still, compared to silence and erasure, her laughter at piano keys and her gentle hand on a horse's flank stand as proof that love could coexist with secrecy, that even in a dynasty's shadows, a life could shine. Belgium, Romania, the Netherlands, 3 monarchies born of different histories, yet bound by the same silence. In each, a child was born whose presence threatened the myth of divine perfection. In each, the solution was the same: concealment, erasure, disappearance. Their stories, when read together, form a triptych of shadows. Belgium. King Leopold II is remembered for his monstrous exploitation of the Congo, his appetite for wealth and empire. But his cruelty extended closer to home. In 1864, his daughter was born with features the court would not name. Official histories omit her altogether, as though she never existed. But servants remembered. In interviews decades later, they spoke of a room in the Brussels palace that was walled off entirely. Behind those walls, they swore, a child's voice could be heard singing nonsense songs, calling for a mother who never came. One maid, Marie Delacroix, risked punishment by slipping food and toys through a narrow gap. In return, she received drawings pushed back, bright, clumsy sketches of sons with smiling faces, of people with enormous grins, of the word mama attempted again and again. One drawing Marie kept until her death, a page of handprints in berry juice, each one encircled with a carefully drawn heart. The princess remained nameless, her room eventually sealed, her memory nearly lost. But Marie's act of remembrance keeps her alive in whispers. Romania. In 1893, the newly established Romanian monarchy confronted its first hidden child. Crown Prince Carol's infant son, born with obvious disabilities, was declared dead within hours. The official announcement spoke of tragedy. The court moved on. But Queen Elizabeth, poet, mystic, writing under the name Carmen Silva, could not accept the silence. In her journals, she wrote of an angel child recalled to heaven, language that veiled the truth while revealing her grief. She claimed to visit his star in dreams, a code for wherever the boy had been hidden. Monastery records from that decade record unusual donations. Funds earmarked for a special child of God, instructions that he be given music, art supplies, kindness. For 7 years, the donations continued. Then they stopped. The monastery's chronicle notes simply, "Our charge has gone to God, gently as he lived." Officially, the prince never lived. Unofficially, he lived long enough to hear music, to draw, to be loved by monks who saw no shame in his difference. The Netherlands. Queen Wilhelmina, remembered as the strong-willed monarch who led her country through war, may have carried a secret of her own. Court records mention only one daughter, Juliana. Yet staff in the palace during the 1892 told a different story. They whispered of a second birth that was never announced. No portraits, no baptism, only a child who lived briefly in the palace before being sent away. Decades later, in Friesland, a farming family told stories of their touch daughter, a girl left with them as an infant by mysterious benefactors who paid for her care but never visited. She bore, they said, an uncanny resemblance to the House of Orange. She grew into adulthood, known for her gentleness, dying in 1934. No proof remains, Only rumor braided into local memory, but the persistence of the tale suggests a truth the archives refuse to preserve. 3 children, 3 nations, 3 silences. Belgium built a wall around its lost daughter. Romania cloaked its angel child in poetry and monasteries. The Netherlands let rumor carry the weight of truth across generations. Different strategies, but the same result: erasure in the name of royal dignity. And yet, each left traces: a maid's smuggled drawing, a queen's mystical journal, a farmer's whispered tale. They remind us that even when dynasties chose silence, memory has ways of surviving through servants, through villagers, through anyone who dared to remember what power wished to forget. Scandinavia, so often imagined as a land of clean lines and honesty, carried its own shadows within royal nurseries. Sweden, Denmark, Norway each cultivated a public image of modern, rational monarchies, less weighed down by centuries of superstition than their southern counterparts. Yet when children were born who did not fit the polished image of dynastic health, the old patterns of concealment repeated. Norway offers perhaps the most haunting example. The monarchy itself was new independent only since 1905, eager to present itself as vigorous, untainted, democratic in spirit. But in 1912, Princess Ragnhild was born to the future King Olav V. Officially, she lived 3 days. Newspapers reported her passing with solemn brevity, and the people mourned a fragile infant. Unofficially, she lived far longer. Records seized decades later from a Swiss medical facility tell of a young girl with the unmistakable features of Down syndrome, who remained in their care for 8 years. Each month, a veiled noblewoman from Norway visited, never revealing her face or name. The girl, described by staff as affectionate and joyful, delighted in the simplest things, touching the snow piled on the window ledge, humming when she heard church bells, clapping at the sight of painted toys. Her death in 1920 was attributed to influenza, though physicians noted congenital heart complications. Norway's monarchy, so new and fragile, erased her swiftly, burying the truth under the fiction of a 3-day life. Sweden, too, carried its secrets. After Prince Carl Oscar's ghostly presence in the palace gardens, a story we have already traced, the pattern continued in whispers around lesser-known branches of the Bernadotte line. Families spoke of cousins who went abroad for treatment and never returned. Servants recalled estates in the countryside where children were kept apart, their names omitted from genealogies. Sweden's monarchy, outwardly more modern, quietly used the same methods as older dynasties: silence, euphemism, disappearance. Denmark had already spun its fiction around Prince Gustav, forever traveling for his health, while in reality he was shifted between secluded estates. Even into the early 20th century, Danish archives preserve similar evasions. Children described only as delicate or frail, their lives reduced to footnotes that concealed more than they revealed. The charade of perpetual health journeys became a royal strategy, one that concealed shame beneath the polite language of convalescence. What unites these Nordic stories is not only their silence, but their timing. By the early 20th century, science had begun to describe Down syndrome with clinical accuracy. Physicians were no longer writing in euphemisms alone. They could identify, categorize, even predict outcomes. Yet monarchies lagged behind, trapped by the old fear that imperfection undermined legitimacy. To acknowledge these children as fully human was to risk unraveling the image of divine appointment. The result was a paradox. Societies famed for their social progress, monarchies that styled themselves modern and enlightened, still behaved in ways no different from their medieval forebears. Whether through a 3-day death announced too soon, or a permanent treatment abroad, the outcome was the same. The children lived in shadows, remembered only in fragments of medical notes, servant whispers, or recovered records. And yet, in those fragments, we see glimpses of their humanity: Princess Ragnhild pressing her hand to snow, Carl Oscar laughing at ant colonies, Gustav predicting weather with uncanny instinct. Joy, curiosity, presence, qualities erased in official records but undeniable in lived reality. Scandinavia's monarchies like to imagine themselves as cleaner, fairer, less burdened by the sins of the old courts. But behind their bright facades, the same shadows stretched long. The 20th century promised light, but for children born different, the shadows deepened before they began to lift. The great turning point did not come from compassion. At first it came from horror. In the 1932nd and 42nd Nazi Germany introduced what it chillingly called the T4 program, the systematic murder of disabled people, men in white coats, trained not in mercy but in efficiency, labeled children with Down syndrome and other conditions as life unworthy of life. Hospitals became execution sites, and tens of thousands were killed, gassed, starved, injected under the guise of medicine. The very qualities that royal families had once hidden in shame were now marked for extermination by the state. For European monarchies, the lesson was brutal. They had spent centuries concealing their disabled children, justifying the silence with words like mercy and release. Now those same rationales appeared in Nazi rhetoric, sharpened into ideology and weaponized into murder. Some royal families, shocked, recognized their complicity. Others doubled down, retreating into even tighter secrecy to ensure no child of theirs might fall into the state's lethal grasp. Yet amidst this darkness, small cracks of change appeared. Consider Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, born in 1915 to Crown Prince Wilhelm. Unlike so many before her, she was not declared dead or entirely erased. Instead, she was placed in a specialized institution where she learned simple texts, how to write her name, how to play piano badly, but with gusto. When the Nazis expanded their euthanasia program, Alexandrine's life was in danger. Records suggest her family arranged for her quiet removal to Switzerland, where she lived under an assumed name until her death in 1988. She outlived the empire she was born to inherit, proof that survival, though fragile, was possible when secrecy was used not to erase but to protect. The war years forced monarchies to confront the consequences of their centuries of concealment. By the 1952, as Europe rebuilt itself on the language of human rights and dignity, the old pattern began to crack. In Luxembourg in 1957, a child was born to the Grand Ducal family with Down syndrome. For the first time in royal history, the family did something radical. They acknowledged him, not fully, not proudly, but honestly enough to admit his existence, and to state that he lived in a special care facility. This was a sliver of daylight after centuries of stone walls and erased names. The 1962nd and 72nd brought medical advances. Children with Down syndrome began to live longer, healthier lives. Heart surgeries extended lifespans, speech therapy opened communication. The old claim that such children inevitably died young was no longer credible. Monarchies could not hide behind mortality. If their children were absent, it was not because they died in infancy, but because the family had chosen silence. Some adapted. They supported charities discreetly, funded institutions quietly, sought ways to soften the narrative without fully embracing it. Others persisted in old habits, keeping their hidden children in remote clinics or private wings of palaces, guarded by euphemisms. Still, the direction of history was shifting. Disability rights movements gained ground. Compassion became a civic virtue, not a private shame. And monarchies, sensitive to their image, were compelled to adjust. The contrast was stark. Only decades earlier, disabled royal children were erased with the stroke of a pen or confined until their deaths. Now, for the first time, the idea emerged that a royal child might be both different and acknowledged. The silence cracked, though it had not yet shattered. The turning point of the 20th century was therefore double-edged. On one side, the nightmare of Nazi extermination revealed the ultimate consequence of seeing disabled lives as burdens. On the other, the post-war world, rebuilding itself on principles of dignity and equality, began to force monarchies into daylight. The shadows did not vanish overnight, but for the first time, the walls built around these children began to thin. From this moment forward, their stories would no longer be entirely erased. They would still be hidden, sometimes sheltered, sometimes sidelined, but they would not always be denied. Let us return to the tower, to that small Habsburg child, clutching a wool blanket in the chill of dawn, watching dust motes float through a shaft of light. We began here with a boy or girl whose name was erased, whose life was reduced to silence. And we end here, because their story is not singular, it is a chorus of silences, an echo chamber that stretches from Vienna to Versailles, from Madrid to Moscow, from the palaces of Lisbon to the convents of Lisbon, from Ottoman domes to Scandinavian forests. Across centuries, royal families responded to the same fact that their bloodlines, for all their claims of divine blessing, were no shield against nature's variations. Some children were erased before they drew breath, declared stillborn when their cries filled the room. Others were hidden away in convents, monasteries, or secluded estates. A few, like Giovanna of Savoy, appeared briefly in public, rehearsed like actors, only to vanish again behind doors, and all of them, whether adored in secret or abandoned to silence, were made into shadows for the sake of dynastic perfection. The true tragedy is not only their confinement, but what it cost the families and societies around them. Parents who might have known love instead learned to practice shame. Siblings who might have grown with compassion were raised in superiority. Monarchies that might have embraced humanity doubled down on illusions of purity. By erasing these children, they diminished themselves, and yet through the cracks, humanity leaked in. Nurses who kept drawings, governesses who wrote tender diaries, monks who christened a child Felix and saw holiness in his laughter, servants who smuggled food and received handprints in return, farmers who raised a girl who might have been a princess. These fragments remind us that while power chose silence, individuals often chose compassion. It was never enough to alter the dynastic script, but it was enough to preserve memory in margins, to save glimpses of joy. Today, we understand what they could not or would not. Down syndrome is not a curse, but a genetic variation found in every land, among every people. We know that those born with it can live long, meaningful lives, filled with love, creativity, and dignity. But the lesson is larger than biology. These hidden children show us how societies treat difference, whether as threat, as shame, or as a chance to recognize our shared humanity. Royal families believed they were guarding thrones. In truth, they were building prisons, prisons for their children, and prisons for themselves, trapped in fear of imperfection. The frescoes on palace ceilings proclaimed divine right, but the rooms of silence beneath them told a different story. That power is fragile, brittle, afraid of its own reflection. Picture the Habsburg child once more. They hum a tune no one else will hear, arrange small objects in patterns that please them, wait for footsteps in the corridor. They are not alone. They are joined by John of Britain at Wood Farm, by the unnamed Bourbon infant of France, by the Romanov girl who laughed at snow, by Maria Francisca folding altar cloths in Lisbon, by Gustav predicting storms in Denmark, by Waldemar listening to trains in Prussia. They are joined by hundreds more whose names we will never know, whose graves are unmarked, whose portraits were burned. Their lives remind us that history is not only the story of crowns and treaties, but also of those whom crowns sought to erase. They force us to confront the fact that power, so often clothed in grandeur, can be most monstrous in its fear of difference. And they ask us to measure civilization not by its palaces, but by how it treats those who cannot play the games of power. In the end, these forgotten royals speak not about Down syndrome, but about us, about the choices societies make when confronted with imperfection. Do we hide it, erase it, wall it up in silence? Or do we embrace it, and learn from it the truth we spend so long avoiding, that variation is not weakness, but the very fabric of humanity? So we return to the tower room. The porridge cools on the stone floor. The light shifts across the wall. The child hums softly, unaware that centuries later we would remember them not as an embarrassment, not as a curse, but as a reminder that even in the most gilded prisons, humanity flickers. And that flicker, once seen, cannot be forgotten. Completed.